Chapter 3, My Early Years. To me, the world is colored with shades of gray. I suppose tragedy and age awakens this truth in us. I am not the kind of person who will quickly sort out my feelings or swiftly categorize people and life's events. There are few purely good or bad guys in the world, few purely just or immoral causes. Mostly, I think, we are all maturing, clawing our way through pain, both obvious and latent, in the hope of building a more joyful tomorrow. It seems Erik isn't alone. We are all searching for that enduring peace. A little more money, a little more privilege, a little more status, a little more something. And I will finally have happiness. But that's the cruel irony of life. Or maybe it's hidden meaning. Maybe it was Jesus' real message to us when he surrendered himself to the cross. True peace couldn't be found in the treasures of the world because the world is always taking back what it gives. All things change, we all age, and as my late husband Chuck so amply taught me, we all die. I don't think anything will make me happy, not anymore, not after Chuck. And perhaps it never could. Yet, isn't my first thought to evaluate a person by their most superficial qualities? Their clothes, their home, their social position. Do any of those things speak to their character, or does it whisper about my own? And what of prisoners? They are the least deserving of our mercy. They are a class despised even more than those too poor or too mentally challenged to find themselves at home. Surely we can't force ourselves to care for them. Even human compassion must have some limits. These had been my general thoughts on the subject of prisons and prisoners, my general thoughts, that is, if ever there had been reasons to give a moment's considerations to the issue. Until Erik, I haven't had a reason to think about prisoners. But sitting on a plane bound for my home in Minnesota, I am struck by how different prisoners could be from my expectations. I didn't anticipate interacting with other prisoners, criminals really. I never imagined a criminal would pull out a chair for me, smile politely, or clean my table. That's just not what I envisioned. Most of the prisoners at Folsom look like decent men, frankly. All the more so, I guess, because it's been conditioned with the belief that criminals are subhuman. They aren't like the rest of us. They're going to hell. We're going to heaven. So we don't have to care about them. In fact, we're going to get to watch them burn for their evil, as if souls in heaven take delight in the suffering of eternal punishment of others. But demons aren't supposed to pull out my chair. They aren't supposed to care if their loved ones are visiting them on a holiday. They aren't supposed to cry at a table with family or baby talk to a giggling child in their arms. Somehow, I feel that most inmates are crying out for help. I'm fairly certain that the last thing I would want is to travel to the road of the condemned. I leave California somehow different. Maybe criminals are simply evil people, dark forces eager to prey on the rest of us, and I am plainly wrong. But it's harder for me to argue with what I saw and felt, with what I have experienced. And then there's Erik. He is nothing like I imagined. Even the letters of our correspondence belied the truth of him. In person, he was so filled with energy. He was sweet and gentle and funny. I'm almost stunned. Is he also to burn in hell? I remember hearing in my Catholic school that there was one person in the Bible Jesus promised would spend paradise with him. In fact, he was the only person to whom Jesus ever personally promised paradise. The man was a prisoner, crucified on Golgotha beside Jesus. A man who showed Christ simple kindness and mercy. Imagine, a man society had condemned spending his afterlife in paradise with Jesus. No wonder I'm confused. Yet I am also restlessly excited. It was wonderful to finally meet Erik, to hug him. I felt so at ease, oddly happy for the first time since Chuck's death. I have a feeling Erik will be a significant friend in my life. Well, my friend Renee asked when I arrived home. Well, what? What was he like? Her eyes sparkle greedily. I know where she's going with the question. Renee, like all women, likes to pretend we are still schoolgirls, and men are interesting and mysterious playthings. I am eager to tell her about my visit, but I'm not comfortable treating Erik like a boyfriend or a crush. She knows why I wanted to meet Erik, why it was good for me, after my own personal tragedy. She assumes it was a good escape. Maybe that's why she is so willing to trivialize everything. Was he cute? That's the last reason I was there, Renee. Oh, so you like him more than just for his looks. Well then, was he sweet? I'm annoyed with the question, but I really can't help it. I smile. Yes. Oh my God, you do like him. He's incarcerated, Renee. What's there to like? He's got a huge sign plastered across his forehead. It says unavailable. Besides, the last complication in the world I need right now is Erik Menendez. Honestly, he's just a friend. How cute, she says, because you really can't tell from seeing him on television. Renee, come on, tell me you never tell me anything. Stop it. I roll my eyes. Yes, he's very handsome. What's he like? I tell her all about our visit. Well, it's about time you visited, Renee says. You've known him for 4 years now. She's right, I have known him for 4 years. What is more frightening, though, is that I now feel like I have known him forever. I shake my head at the thought and push it away. Renee is one of my best friends. I want her to understand that deep connection I experienced with Erik. But I hold back in telling her about it. Would she understand? How could she? I don't even understand it. She'd call it a crush, but it's nothing of the sort. I know what a crush feels like. This isn't one. I feel an indescribable bond with him, like somebody finally understands me. Perhaps we all search for that kind of connection in life. Some of us find it, many of us don't. But what do you do when you find that kind of connection with a guy who's in prison? And why outside of Minnesota? I love Minnesota, except for the weather. All my life, I've been searching for a friend to share that kind of intimate bond with. But I never expected this. I never wanted this. I was born in a tiny, cozy place known as Chisholm, Minnesota. I was not raised by the woman who gave birth to me. I would not see her again for 18 years. The hands that took me in were soft, caring, tender ones. They were the hands of my mom in every sense of the word, except for the most meaningless one, genetics. I was raised in her love among the beautiful Lakeport streets of Dult, Minnesota. We were a middle-class family with middle-class values. My mom was a simple woman with traditional ethics. She was a Catholic, a volunteer, a hard worker, and most of all, a soft heart, which made her choice in men perplexing. She married a grumpy, unaffectionate man. That was my dad. He was my dad until after 25 years of marriage. My mom had enough of being bullied, bossed, and berated. One day, she simply kicked him out of our house. It was just before I turned 13. Dad wasn't a terrible father, in a relative sense. He didn't beat, molest, or otherwise physically abuse me. He just wasn't an understanding or nurturing person at all. In fact, he had a fairly simple policy. Stay out of his way, be seen, and not heard. He came from a very abusive family. He had a drinking problem for years, as did his sisters and brothers. He stopped drinking several years after my mom divorced him, but the change came too late for all of us. We had one ritual in the house that sticks out in my mind and exemplifies the relationship in my family. At supper, Dad refused to allow me to leave the table until I cleared the plate. I had to eat everything, even the beets. This dinner table rite is a typical form of needless excess administered to children of my generation. I understand the principle and the value system that emerged from the Great Depression, but kids are still kids. Dinner time with family should be fun. Naturally, I developed a phobia of large meals. It wasn't unusual to find little me still seated in front of a half-eaten plate on which the food was sort of been pushed around to look like it's been tried, more than an hour after everyone had finished. My mom, bless her heart, was placed in charge of monitoring my food intake. She was too devout a follower of St. Paul to actually go against her husband's wishes, but that didn't ease the misery she felt at the sight of her daughter stuck in an oversized chair mulling over a cold dinner. On the other hand, what she didn't know she could plausibly deny. So she'd take trips to the bathroom and leave me alone with Bebe, our dog. Dogs make for wonderful accomplices for young kids at dinner time. They'll eat cold leftovers so fast that if you blink, you would swear the dog never opened her mouth. Trust me, I know. I did have one problem, though. Bebe didn't like to eat beets. I would stuff a beet in Bebe's mouth and she'd spit it back out like a Pez dispenser. So I'd have to hold my nose and swallow the beet, while Bebe ate the rest. That was our deal. Then a few minutes after Bebe and I broke bread together, my mom would stroll back into the kitchen and exclaim loudly for my dad to hear over the television about what a good girl I was for eating all the food on my plate. I remember thinking, Mom is a very sweet person, but she sure isn't too bright. It seemed every night she'd head to the bathroom. When she returned, there was a clean plate and Bebe at my side. And she never ever let on that she knew. I was a cute but shy girl. Shy girls tend to be loners, not by choice but by virtue of their bashfulness. Thankfully, despite my nature, I didn't lack for friends in my small town. Maybe it was because of the great adventures I was known for. Most of them, unfortunately, were only in my mind. I also was known for an active imagination. To me, everything was very real, including the people who visited me in my dreams. No, I didn't see dead people, but I did routinely have two ghostly friends who would come to me while I slept, lift me out of my body, and fly me around the house, down the stairs, through the halls, and outside into the country. It was scary when I think of how often I dreamed of these adventures, but I had a great time in my dreams, and I could weave a great story with my friends the next day. I attended high school in Hibbing, Minnesota. The school had a beautiful stone building on a spacious campus. Hibbing was a kind of oasis in America, where people didn't lock their doors and kids were safe to walk to school. This was small-town Minnesota, where you knew just about everyone in the community. And as in most cozy towns, people had a way of life to preserve. People observed an unwritten code of conduct. Family heritage was cherished. There was no extensive judicial system or large city jail because there was no need for one. Crime was low, and neighbors actually walked across the street to help one another when the need arose. It was not a well-known community or an important one, but it represented an era and a segment of history that was rapidly dying in America. At times, it was almost as if the people of Hibbing knew their way of life wouldn't survive much longer. As a community, we clung to the ethic and character taught by our parents and their parents. We were proud not to have lost our soul to the popular culture. Many of my high school mates thought I was stuck up. They didn't realize I was just shy, overwhelmed by all the parties and teenage social pressures. I didn't drink because I saw what it had done to my father. The only drug I ever saw in high school was marijuana. I tried it once, and it put me fast asleep. I didn't join the cheerleading squad, but I did become pretty enough as I aged to attract some of the really cute guys in my school. This, coupled with the fact that I was shy, caused me some problems. Some of the girls took my avoidance as a rejection of them. But throughout my early years, life was fairly simple. I have posters of David Cassidy. I wore the styles of the day, and I sunbathed by the pool in a bikini. When I was 16, I had my first kiss. He was unusually timid. So was I. The touch was sweet, warm, and mysterious. I could taste that kiss for days. I began traveling the path of puppy love and tearful breakups. Then I met Jim. He was a charming, good-looking, tender guy. I fell in love. We were married before long. I was pregnant. We had a beautiful daughter and named her Lisa. I thought I'd found forever. Forever lasted about 2 years. Our divorce was quick but painful. Jim and I loved one another. We just weren't right for each other. I turned 20 in the early 80s. That's when I met Chuck. Before Chuck, my life had been serene. Never perfect, but serene. All of that was about to change. Chuck swept into my life with the same dazzling speed he would later leave the earth under. The first day I met him, I remember thinking that this handsome, young, charismatic guy was like fire. His sheer presence blazed and illuminated everything in his path. At first meeting, he was one of the warmest, most genuinely friendly people I had ever met. His large blue eyes danced and flashed expressively, and a grin constantly adorned his face. He was thick with the kind of muscle that is acquired early in life from constant exposure to athleticism. And his large hands, once used to captain the wrestling team and to convey signals from home plate as a high school catcher, had now been thrust into a new role as the vehicle for his self-expression. Chuck spoke with his hands and eyes as much as with his voice, and his face revealed an intelligence that was impressive and welcoming all at once. Chuck and I met on a summer evening at a party for mutual friends near a place known infamously and simply enough as the Watering Hole. And it was not long before we were dating. What Chuck added to my life in terms of excitement, I returned in the form of order and domestication. When we met, Chuck liked to keep his shirts in a cardboard box and his keys and wallet wherever luck or chance might dictate. He was seemingly well educated and had risen from a lovely family, but his ambition clearly outpaced his experience. He was the kind of man who had heard of Shakespeare and Sophocles and who might even have read their work at some point in his schooling. But the only hero he aspired to emulate was the self-made kind. He read stories by and about men like T-Bone Pickens and Ross Perot, not Proust or Plato. Ironically, he reminded me more of a character from classic literature than any undersized, overhyped business-like figure. Chuck was as impressive as a Greek hero with his eloquence and his courage and his enthusiasm. He was also as mortal. Like many Greek heroes, it was his flaw that was his undoing. I wouldn't say the day I met Chuck I knew I'd marry him, but it's true the day I met him I knew I could marry him. In a way, I believe our union was destined to be. This path was given to us before we were born. It's not that Chuck was my soulmate. He wasn't. But we had lessons to teach each other. We had hardships to pass on, like gifts of hard medicine. Despite our different personalities and backgrounds, during our time together, we held a shared vision of the life we wanted to build, a beautifully idealized crystal image. In the end, that image would shatter in 100 ways and open me to as many wounds. If Chuck was like fire, then his flames also burned, and I made the mistake of holding on to him a little too long. It'd be easy to say that just about everybody liked Chuck. The truth is, they loved him. He had a mind born from business and a quality of leadership that made people want to work for him. He was called Gold Fingers because every business deal he took on made money. He could sell snow to an Eskimo and still do it in an ethical way. One of his first business ventures was a real estate brokerage purchased from a local businessman. Chuck had apprenticed at a local agency before striking out on his own, with only the smallest amount of experience. What he lacked in outright experience he made up for with his savvy and attention to detail. Chuck would attend to every detail of a sale, focusing on the most specific wants and needs of the buyer, no matter how mundane, all the while determining the expectations of the seller and the true value of the property. I still remember one occasion when a home sale looked like it was going to fall apart, the kind of rare failure that Chuck wasn't prepared to accept. He stayed up nights worrying about a home buyer and seller who each wanted a seemingly worthless piece of stone. Our hometown of Hibbing had been a steel mining town with a rich history during the Industrial Revolution. Bob Dylan, who grew up with my mother and attended school in Hibbing with her, would later write songs about the waning life of the town. And by the time Chuck and I were adults, the town's mining history was its calling card. Many people displayed the history of the town in their homes in one way or another. With this particular home, there was a century-old massive boulder on the property, with a man-made drill hole bored through the center. The seller was leaving the state, but wanted to take the stone with him as a reminder of the city's heritage. The buyer felt the stone should be left on the property as a piece of local history. I thought the whole thing was ridiculous, but the buyer and seller actually fought over this detail after the contract had been signed. The dispute escalated into a cauldron of accusations until Chuck came up with the answer. He had a friend who kept heavy machinery of various kinds from his father's mining business. If the buyer wanted a rock with a 2-foot hole bored through the center and aged to give the feel of a century-old artifact, Chuck would find a way. Over the course of a week, I watched in amazement as Chuck brought in a team of handymen who did everything but carbon date his replica to make sure it would satisfy the buyer. It was hardwired into Chuck's personality to meet his clients' expectations, no matter how unreasonable they might be. Chuck's excellence was not limited to work. When he walked into a party, the energy level sharply rose. Occasionally, I'd actually hear a cheer erupt. He was everybody's friend. He built time into his schedule each day to meet and talk with people around town. One Saturday morning, I found him taking batting practice at a local field from some of the neighborhood kids, bat in one hand and the phone in another. He was handling a real estate deal while chatting up some 12-year-old boys. He was everywhere and nowhere all at the same time. Getting Chuck's undivided attention was a feat of tremendous human strength, but he was adept at making people comfortable with his distraction, and virtually everyone he met was happier for the experience. Of course, in many ways, he was a perfect balance to my personality. I preferred to stand in the shadow outside the spotlight and watch him create magic with his smile. With ease, he became the life of any gathering, with his true storytelling abilities. Nobody could tell a joke like Chuck. His personality was a magnet for the attention he so craved, the attention that would pull me and everyone else towards him. I realize now, was the same force that would ultimately push me away. I needed more attention than my husband was able to give. Chuck spread his love like light for all to see. It was brilliant and inspiring. But for the one person to whom he returned each day, the afterglow was faint. Too often, Chuck simply left me empty. And what was worse, he didn't need my constant efforts to feel whole. My attempts to become the person who brought him the most love and assistance and attention each day fell short of what he wanted and needed. Chuck was so easy to fall for, too easy, but he was much harder to be married to. Of course, I suppose much of my assessment depended on what I was looking for. I was looking for romance and a best friend wrapped into one package. I wanted a man who would make our lives his priority, but that wasn't in Chuck's way. I was his wife, not his companion. He gave me diamonds, not romance. I'm not complaining. Diamonds are a traditional substitute for love and romance, and we did love each other. We had our adventures and fun, and we made a very pretty couple. For nearly 15 years, Chuck and I struggled through heartache and laughter, triumph and failure, until we had realized an American dream. Our family became a classic success story. Those were the years when I still believe that childhood dreams came true for all of us, when the illusion of external happiness still felt real. The clouds were soon to form, the rain to pour. Success, I had not yet realized, occurs within, through personal growth, rather than by creating perfect life circumstances. Hardship is a teacher. our friend disguised as a painful enemy. But those lessons would be hard won, and were some distance off. During our marriage, Chuck's incredible talent for business, his good looks, and his charismatic personality earned him greater and greater success. People wanted to do business with him. New friendships sprouted and blossomed. Chuck adored the attention. He thrived on being the center of it all. By the age of 26, Chuck owned his own real estate company. In the years that followed, his income and connections soared. He bought a convenience store, a liquor store, an apartment complex, and then later several apartment complexes, a rental company for which he ultimately opened several locations, and he did all of it while building new homes, renovating old ones, and creating a real estate development business that thrived with opportunity. Unfortunately, with each new success came another lonely night for me in an empty bed. The greater our prosperity, the less time we had together. It didn't seem to bother Chuck, and he tried fervently to pretend that it didn't bother me either. One night I asked him if he would shut his phone off, just while we ate dinner. He humored me for about 10 minutes. Then he was up to place a call he had forgotten to make earlier. Like most young girls, I believed in storybook romances and the adventures of young love. I didn't realize how difficult it would be for me to find a man who knew how to love well. Intuitively, I knew I wanted someone who would encourage me to grow rather than fear my development. But I thought most men would want that for me. I thought young husbands were supposed to be Mr. Wonderful. Reality settled in slowly. Most significantly in my life, I was a young mother to a beautiful girl named Lisa. She was my prized jewel. I'd heard stories, sometimes from my own mother, about how difficult girls could be to raise. But all those myths were drowned away by Lisa. She had the sweetest nature. She was independent-minded, extremely resourceful, and capable. Without a doubt, she completely spoiled me to motherhood. I couldn't understand why people talked about the difficulties of raising girls. Lisa certainly had wonderful grandparents who spoiled her, but regardless of the help, she was easy to parent and fun to be around. All of this was before Talia was born, my little sweet wild child, who would force me to learn just how rare Lisa's nature was. While Chuck was beavering away and Lisa was in school, my day slowed to a crawl. I decided to pursue a career in a field I loved, which meant doing something with animals. I had always loved animals, and so without much planning, I settled on dog grooming. It seemed like the perfect career choice, and it would allow me to build my professional life and interest. I decided to discuss the possibility with Chuck, and mentioned a 6-week course at the New York School of Dog Grooming. Secretly, I dreaded the idea of spending 6 weeks away from home. At dinner, I raised the subject, hoping Chuck would protest, but his response was what I had expected. Dog grooming? Great idea, you should go. After dinner, when I was washing the dishes, he just couldn't understand what all the banging was about. I spent 6 very lonely and miserable weeks in New York City. I worried about Lisa and made daily phone calls to check on the arrangements I had made for her activities. On the trip to New York, I learned some powerful lessons about marriage. I did this by making almost every mistake in the book. Calling Chuck and asking to come home, starting fights when he didn't call or demand more of my time, creating friendships I knew he wouldn't particularly appreciate or approve of, and calling him from every noisy and crowded location I could find, just to prove that I was a whirling dervish bent of excitement. Persistence I had hoped would wear Chuck down. So pathetically, and I actually did this, I called him at least 5 times a day, always pretending there was an important business or family matter that had to be discussed. I was in my 20s and my antics may have been forgivable, but I still deserved a dunce hat. As it turned out, I was a natural for the business. I excelled in my class. 6 weeks later, degree in hand, I flew home, eager to open my new pet grooming shop. Chuck was genuinely happy and supportive. I'm sure in retrospect, he looked forward to the possibility that I would at last be occupied and overwhelmed in a way I had never really been while raising an angel like Lisa. I began making plans for my business. But as I was doing this, I slowly settled back into the only vocation I had ever known, Chuck's assistant and sounding board, and Lisa's mom. I loved these jobs, so it seemed just as well. Our life was no longer simple, but it was relatively easy. I was caught up in living the perfect yuppie life. I had no idea how successful Chuck was going to be materially, but I had no doubt it was far more than even he could have imagined. So we focused on all the things that our culture not so subtly instills in us, from the mendicancy of the perfect lawn, the decorations, and the spit-polished cars and clothes, to the positions of importance in local civic, business, and education organization. We pretended that all of it was important to us, when in reality, the only thing we relished was the feeling of significance we got and the recognition we received. We also became slowly but perceptibly more shallow and disconnected. It's amazing how something as simple as having the wrong pair of shoes on can consume a person, pushing to the side those things of true importance. Sadly, very little of our success translated into a closer bond. What began as a small emotional divide between us gradually expanded. For so many hours, I'd sit as if alone next to my husband, who had so much to offer and yet who offered me so very little in the way of affection and connection and understanding. I sat there, year after year, emotionally starved. We might as well have been 10,000 miles from each other. Unfortunately, I didn't realize my relationship should be any different. I convinced myself that all marriages were like mine. Every man was emotionally disconnected. I remember laying in bed, terribly sick during my pregnancy with Talia, a pregnancy I truly and naively believed would bring Chuck closer to me, and asking Chuck to stay at home one night instead of going out with the boys. Chuck patted my hand, kissed my forehead, told me, "You'll be fine," and went off with his friends. That night, I cried myself to sleep. I knew we were in trouble. I loved him. I needed him. But he didn't know how to cope with the demands of a healthy marriage. And in any event, that is how he had made me feel when it came to our relationship. As if my needs were demands. Demands that would have to be balanced against the more pressing demands of business. He could be brilliant in his work, but when it came to our marriage, he just wouldn't invest the same effort. And he didn't see our relationship as anything more than an effort. In the end, I realized I was not only naive in placing my hopes in another person, but completely unprepared to keep our love strong. When the strain of Chuck's businesses increasingly reduced our time together, it'd be fair to say we fell into a groove. There were deep pockets of resentment in our relationship, and times when I'd withdraw in a futile attempt to punish him. But more or less, we maintained a simple, loving friendship in our marriage. Chuck wasn't my best friend by any means, and at times I could hardly talk to him, but he was my husband, and our worlds were wrapped around each other. As long as I didn't allow myself to expect too much from Chuck romantically, I wouldn't get hurt. In time, I stopped expecting much of anything at all. I felt alone, in a safe, comfortable life. I learned to cope, and I believe that the loneliness I felt was the worst I would have to endure in my life. As it would turn out, I had yet to know true loneliness, but the experience wouldn't be far off. I had no sense of the freight train that was bearing down on me and the life changes ahead.